I wasn't spying. I wasn't looking for a reason to be suspicious. I was just driving past a house where I was never meant to matter. I had coffee in my hand and thoughts in my head about a construction project I hadn't touched in years. And then I saw it. The familiar car at the gate. A silver Toyota Corolla. My wife. My Sandra. She had never had a reason to be there alone. I didn't stop because I wanted to know. I stopped because I could no longer not know. I walked up to the window, and everything I thought I knew about my life collapsed in a single breath. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Henry Thomas Miller. I was 74 years old when the ground beneath my life first began to shift. For most of those years, I had been a builder, not in some poetic or abstract sense, but a man who knew the weight of wood and the rhythm of hammers. I built things. I measured, poured, framed, and fixed. My work was in neighborhoods across Georgia, elementary schools with clean lines and safe steps, fire stations with wide bays and red doors, homes where families grew old, and dogs barked at mailmen. My fingerprints were in the concrete of those foundations. I wasn't educated beyond high school. My hands were my tools, and my eyes were trained to see what others missed. A crooked beam, a warped nail, a tiny crack that meant trouble 6 months down the line. I was good at it. Not flashy, not famous, but solid. People knew me for showing up early, staying late, and finishing what I started. I was never the man giving speeches at ribbon cuttings, but I was always somewhere nearby, leaning against a wall I had helped erect, watching others take pictures. My back started to give out when I hit 69. The long days on ladders, the heavy lifting, the summers soaked through with sweat. It all came back to collect. I didn't resent it. The pain was a kind of proof. I had earned it honestly. After a minor stroke, my hands shook too much for the precision I used to pride myself on. That's when I stepped back, not entirely by choice, but by the slow, quiet force of age. I handed off most of the projects to younger men. I still visited sites, gave advice, checked measurements. I was useful, though not central. I told myself that was enough. We lived in a small town not far from Macon, Georgia, where people still nodded to one another on the sidewalk and left pies on the porch. Our house was modest but strong. I had built the front steps myself twice, once when we moved in, and again when the wood rotted out after 15 years. I replaced the roof with my own hands the year my youngest daughter got married. I planted a dogwood tree by the mailbox and trimmed it every spring until my knees started locking up. I married Sandra in 1971. We met at a 4th of July cookout when I was still learning the trade, and she was working as a receptionist at the county office. She was kind in the way women used to be taught to be, but sharp underneath. She had a mind like a ledger book, precise, quiet, unforgiving. She ran the house. I ran the job sites. That balance worked for a long time. Our children grew up knowing discipline and routine. There were rules. There was dinner at 6. There were early mornings and lawn care on Saturdays. I taught them how to patch a wall, how to hold a flashlight for your father without complaining, how to not cry over splinters. Now, decades later, that version of me, the man who wore the same flannel shirt until it tore under the arms, who refused to buy pre-cut lumber because it felt dishonest, felt far away. I spent my mornings reading the paper in silence, watching the coffee pot burble like a metronome. I took long walks around the block, counting cracks in the pavement and noting which houses I had touched with my labor. I smiled at strangers who didn't smile back. The world no longer needed my kind, and that was fine. I didn't expect it to. But there was something dangerous about becoming invisible, not to the world at large, but to the people who once looked up to you. I had built homes, shaped towns, reinforced walls against hurricane winds. Yet within my own family, my legacy was reduced to a faded photo and an occasional question about taxes or gutters. My wife no longer asked what I thought. My children assumed I'd agree to anything they planned. My voice, once firm and weighty, had softened to something background. Still, I held on to my rituals. I sharpened my pencils every Sunday night. I kept my toolbox polished and oiled, even though I barely used it. I maintained my old truck with devotion, checking the oil with the precision of a surgeon. I had built that truck's bed from scratch back in '85, when the factory metal rusted through. No one saw that as impressive anymore. To them, it was just a creaky old vehicle. But to me, it was history with an engine. There was one wall in the garage where I kept the framed blueprint of the first house I ever built on my own. It had cost me a broken wrist and 2 months of sleepless nights, but it had stood through 3 tornado seasons and was still lived in by the original buyers. That blueprint was more than a memory. It was proof. Proof that I had once mattered in a way that concrete, not sentiment, could hold. I didn't talk much about myself. Men of my generation weren't raised to share feelings or seek validation. We earned our place and shut up about it. But silence is not the same as peace. It can rot from the inside. I began to notice that I was holding my breath when I walked into rooms, that I listened more for tone than for words, that I flinched at laughter if it wasn't mine, and that I found myself lingering in the garage longer than necessary, staring at the things I had built, as if they might remind me who I had been. I wasn't afraid of death. I was afraid of becoming a footnote in someone else's story, of being remembered as the old man who lived with Mom, or worse, not remembered at all. My hands had calluses like bark. My eyes had watched houses rise and fall. I didn't need praise. I just didn't want to vanish. That morning, before the car ride that would change everything, I stood by the back window of our house with a cup of coffee and looked out at the fence I had reinforced the summer our middle child moved out. It leaned slightly now, weathered and soft at the joints, like me, still standing, still mine. For now. The strange thing about fading from your own life is that it doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow unraveling, like a rope fraying at the end, thread by thread, day by day. I didn't wake up one morning and find myself invisible. It crept up on me in silence, through half-closed doors, unanswered questions, and conversations I was no longer invited into. The walls of my house, once built with my hands, began to press in with a stillness I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a haunted kind of silence. It was worse. It was ordinary. There was a time when I could hear my own life echo through the hallways, the hammering of my boots at the door after a long day, the familiar creak of floorboards near the sink where I stood every morning, brushing sawdust from my sleeves before coffee, the smell of oil, rust, sweat, and wood. Those things used to belong to me. But the house had changed. Or maybe I had. Either way, I no longer felt like its heart. I had become a shadow in the corners, something too soft to be noticed and too steady to be questioned. My wife, Sandra, moved around the house with a rhythm that no longer included me. She didn't mean harm, at least I don't think she did, but her days had taken on a shape I didn't fit into. She moved faster now, always with a list, a reason to be in motion, a text to reply to. Her face was calm, composed, polite. She asked if I needed anything when she passed by, but didn't wait for the answer. I started to nod by default, even when I didn't know what she was asking. She began spending more time outside, on the porch, in the garden, or out running errands, a phrase that had become her favorite cover for long absences. When she came home, her phone stayed close to her palm, like a lifeline. I noticed the way her eyes lingered on the screen longer than necessary. The smile she gave it was a soft one, absent-minded, comfortable, a kind of tenderness I hadn't seen on her face in years. It wasn't directed at me, and I didn't ask who it was for. The kitchen was no longer a place where we shared meals. We ate at separate times. I woke earlier, made my own breakfast, and listened to the quiet click of utensils in a house that once rang with laughter and footsteps. The table, once a site of family debates and Sunday pancakes, now held magazines, bills, and sometimes nothing at all. I stopped sitting there unless I needed to sort mail. Even the chairs seemed to forget the weight of shared meals. I started walking in circles, around the block, through the backyard, through my memories. I would pause at the corner of the living room where our children once lined up in their church clothes, smiling awkwardly for Christmas photos. The nail where the old calendar used to hang was still there, bare now, forgotten. I ran my fingers over it once, just to feel something solid. The TV played shows I didn't understand anymore. Game shows too loud, dramas too fast, commercials too desperate. Sandra liked them. She said they helped her relax. I stayed in the den, where the old recliner still held the shape of my back. The remote was sticky. The cushions sagged. It felt honest. Like me. Worn, dependable, ignored. At night, she'd sometimes sleep on her side of the bed, and sometimes on the couch. She said her back hurt. I didn't argue. I stopped asking. I listened instead, to the way the refrigerator hummed, to the way the water heater kicked on, to the wind against the windows. I learned the language of neglect. It was quiet, but constant. The mail kept coming. Most of it wasn't mine anymore. Letters addressed to Sandra Miller, catalogs for women's shoes, charity flyers from places I'd never heard of. I sorted them into piles without reading. She had a system now, and I didn't interfere. Our daughter Emily visited often. Her husband never came in. He stayed in the car or dropped her off. I never liked him. He had that polite distance that never fully left his smile. When he did come in, he never looked me in the eyes. He shook my hand like it was a formality, not a connection. Emily loved him, so I stayed quiet. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and heard laughter. A deep, warm, unguarded laugh. It came from Sandra's mouth. I hadn't heard her laugh like that in years. She was on the phone. When she noticed me, she turned away slightly, her voice lowering into something private. I stood there for a moment watching her. Then I opened the fridge and took a bottle of water I didn't want. I walked out before she finished the call. That was the night I realized she no longer looked surprised to see me. The calendar on the wall still marked holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, doctor's appointments. My name wasn't written on any of them. The last time it had been there was 6 months ago, for a checkup I'd gone to alone. I stared at that blankness like it meant something, like erasure could be charted in pencil and squares. Sometimes I wondered if I had done something to deserve it. Maybe I had failed her in ways I couldn't remember. Maybe I had become too quiet, too slow, too dull. But the truth was simpler and worse. I had become irrelevant, not through cruelty, but through time. I stopped sitting in my chair at the head of the table. I stopped offering opinions. I stopped asking what the plans were. I began to live around them, in the gaps they left. I mowed the lawn when no one was watching. I folded my laundry in the garage. I read old manuals and watched the dust gather on the windowsill. My life had become a whisper in a house that used to echo with my name. One morning, I stood in the hallway and saw my own reflection in the glass frame of a family photo. The light hit it just right, and there I was, a ghost layered behind smiling faces. I stared at that ghost and wondered if anyone else still saw him. I had spent decades building structures that stood against storms. Now, the storm was silence. And it was winning. It was supposed to be just a quiet drive, a nothing sort of day, one of those Tuesdays that slipped through the cracks of a calendar without leaving a mark. I'd gone out to pick up a box of screws and some sandpaper from the hardware store, even though I didn't really need them. I had dozens of each in the garage, all sorted neatly in old coffee tins. But driving gave me a purpose. A road was a place where the world felt briefly under control. Lanes, rules, signs. You could follow them and not be questioned. I took the long way home. It was something I started doing more often, circling back through neighborhoods I used to know better, where my hands had built things that still stood, if not unchanged, then at least still upright. There was comfort in the bones of the familiar. The cracked sidewalk by the old post office, the oak tree that leaned a little more every year, the crooked fence line that I had fixed twice, once for free. That's when I turned down the street I hadn't driven in months. It wasn't even conscious. My hands did the turning, as if they had a memory all their own. The road was smooth, newly paved. I recognized the mailbox before the house, the big black one with the metal flag that always stuck. I had helped set that post when Emily and her husband bought the place. Jason had made a big deal out of wanting to do it himself, but the concrete mix had been too dry, and I ended up showing him how to reset it without shaming him. The house came into view slowly, like a photograph developing in my memory. White shutters, trimmed hedges, a swing set that no child used anymore. And then my eyes landed on something that shouldn't have been there. It was a silver Toyota Corolla, mid-2000s model. Slight dent on the rear passenger side. Georgia plates. My wife's car. I knew it without question. I had driven it to the dealership with her when she bought it. She'd insisted on silver because it hid the dirt. I remembered the coffee stain on the passenger mat, the one she'd tried to scrub out with vinegar. That was her car, and it was parked in Jason's driveway. The engine of my own truck seemed to fade into the background, like the world had lowered its volume to make room for my thoughts. I slowed down, not because I meant to. My foot just eased off the gas like it had made a decision before I had. I pulled to the side of the road a few houses down, far enough not to be seen, close enough to confirm what I already knew. My heart wasn't racing. It was worse than that. It was steady, heavy. A rhythm too calm for the thoughts tumbling through me. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield like it could explain things. Maybe Sandra had dropped something off. Maybe Emily had borrowed the car. Maybe. But I'd been married long enough to know when something didn't add up. Sandra hated driving in that part of town. She said the streets were too tight, the turns too sharp. She only went there if she had to, and no one had said anything about needing her to. I checked the clock. 3:47 p.m. That time meant nothing, but it stuck. The windows of the house were open. The curtains shifted slightly with the breeze, and I imagined the sound of voices, clinking glasses, soft laughter, things I wasn't meant to hear, things that, once heard, couldn't be unheard. I opened the glove compartment and took out a napkin, wiped my palms without thinking. They weren't sweating. I just needed to do something with my hands. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked the same. Calm, blank, like a man waiting for traffic to pass. But I wasn't waiting. I turned off the engine and stepped out. The air was warm and thick with the scent of trimmed grass and something cooking, maybe garlic, maybe onions. It made my stomach turn. I crossed the street slowly, pretending not to care if someone saw me, but taking a path between the trees so that no one would. The gravel crunched beneath my boots. I walked past a rose bush I had once planted there. It was blooming. I hadn't known it would bloom this year. I stopped at the edge of the lawn and looked again at the car. It was parked straight, not hurried. She had taken her time. That's what got to me. She hadn't stopped by. She had come in, settled in. I stood there longer than I should have. Just far enough to see, but not be seen. Just far enough to feel the shape of a reality I hadn't wanted to name. I thought about turning back, about walking away and forgetting I ever saw it, about convincing myself that it was all innocent. But my legs didn't move. Not back, not forward. I was frozen in that moment, like someone waiting for permission to feel what they already knew. I scanned the porch. No movement. Then a flicker behind the curtain. A figure, a shape, a motion too familiar. It disappeared again. I knew it was her. The way she moved was imprinted in my bones. The tilt of the head, the way she leaned when she laughed. It didn't need to be confirmed. It was already truth. And then I saw Jason. He stepped into view, barefoot, holding a wine glass, walking casually toward the front door like it was his home, and not just his in the legal sense. I didn't breathe. He opened the door without knocking, the door that locked automatically from the inside. He didn't use a key. I turned around. I didn't want to see more. I didn't want to see what I couldn't forget. The weight of it pressed against my ribs, not like betrayal, but like confirmation. The kind that didn't need witnesses or words. Just one car, parked in one driveway, at the wrong time, on the wrong day. I walked back to my truck. The napkin was still on the passenger seat. I picked it up and folded it, careful and precise, as if that small act could hold back the flood gathering behind my eyes. I didn't start the engine right away. I sat there in silence, watching the house disappear behind the trees. Something in me shifted that day. Not anger, not sadness, something colder, heavier, like a door closing in my chest, sealing off everything that had once been known and trusted. The car was still parked there when I drove away, and I knew, as surely as I knew how to level a foundation or drive a nail straight, that everything had already changed. I hadn't intended to get out of the truck. That part still troubled me later. I could have driven past. I could have shaken my head, told myself it was nothing, turned the radio up, and gone home. But I didn't. I killed the engine and stepped out like a man going into a burning building, already knowing the heat, already tasting the smoke, already accepting that something would not be the same when he came out again. I moved along the edge of the property line with the kind of slowness that comes from dread rather than stealth. It was quiet on that street. No dogs barking, no children playing. The silence had weight to it, like a breath held too long. I walked past the flower beds that needed trimming, past the porch swing that still creaked in the breeze, and around the side of the house where the shadows stretched longer. I stopped near the side window. It wasn't large, just a narrow pane of glass, partially smudged from the outside, the way windows always are when no one bothers to clean them. I remembered helping Jason install that window when they remodeled the kitchen. He had mismeasured the opening, and I had to plane the frame down to make it fit. I hadn't been invited to help again after that. He didn't like needing me. The grass beneath my boots was soft. I shifted my weight slowly, careful not to make a sound, though I knew the odds of being heard through a closed window were slim. But the impulse to move silently was stronger than logic. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. But I felt something else, something deeper, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. I leaned slightly toward the glass. The curtain inside had been drawn back. It was pinned in a way that looked deliberate, as if someone wanted the light to come in, or the view to stay clear. I adjusted my stance to see more. There in the kitchen sat my wife, Sandra. She was barefoot, sitting on the stool by the counter, the same one Emily used to do homework on when she was in high school. Her posture was relaxed, casual in a way I hadn't seen in years. Her shoulders weren't tense, her face wasn't drawn tight. There was a softness to her that startled me, a familiarity that felt foreign. In front of her stood Jason. He was pouring something into 2 glasses, wine, I assumed, from the angle of the bottle. He laughed at something she said. She tilted her head toward him, smiling. Her hand rested on the counter, close to his, not touching, but near enough that the space between them seemed intentional, intimate, practiced. I watched as he handed her a glass. Their fingers brushed. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She accepted the glass with a nod and took a sip. Her lips left a faint mark on the rim. She said something, and he laughed again, throwing his head back like a man who felt safe. The air behind that window felt thick, like it had been sealed in a jar too long. The kind of air you don't breathe, but wade through. I pressed my palm gently against the siding beside the window, needing something solid beneath my skin. Something to anchor me in the reality that was unraveling in front of my eyes. They looked comfortable, not sneaking, not tense. Comfortable. That was the part I couldn't explain away. I had expected fear, maybe guilt, something in their posture that suggested shame. But there was none. They looked like people who belonged in that room, who had shared that scene before, who would share it again. I glanced down at the driveway. Her car was still there, parked neatly, not like someone making a quick visit, like someone who had planned to stay a while. I looked back inside. Jason was leaning against the counter now, sipping his drink. She reached across and took a napkin, dabbing the edge of her mouth with familiarity. There was music playing, faint, distant, just enough to see the rhythm in her foot as it tapped lightly against the stool leg. She was at ease, more than at ease. She was glowing. I couldn't remember the last time she looked like that with me. It wasn't the betrayal that hit first. It was the foreignness, the realization that I was watching someone I had known for over 50 years become a stranger. The lines of her face, the cadence of her voice, the tilt of her head. I knew them all. But not like this, not through glass, not from the outside. I didn't move. I don't know how long I stood there. 5 minutes, 10, maybe more. Time became irrelevant in that moment. I wasn't a husband. I wasn't a father. I wasn't even a man. I was just a witness. A breathing pair of eyes in the shadow of a life that no longer made room for me. The wine glasses clinked. They laughed again. She reached out and touched his hand. It was light, quick, natural. I turned away, not in anger, not in panic, but because I couldn't afford to see more. I walked slowly back the way I came, retracing each step like I was undoing a crime scene. The gravel crunched. The wind picked up slightly. I felt it push against the back of my neck like a warning, or maybe a permission. When I got back to the truck, I sat inside and gripped the steering wheel. The leather was warm from the sun. I stared at my hands, calloused, lined, shaking just a little. These were the hands that built her porch, her kitchen cabinets, her life. And now they sat idle while someone else held the wine glass she raised. I didn't start the engine right away. I waited for my breath to slow, for my chest to stop aching, for the truth to settle in. Behind that window, they were still laughing. Inside the house I once helped paint, beneath the roof I once repaired after a storm, and in that moment, I knew something had died. Not loudly, not with violence, but with the hush of a curtain being pulled shut. When I got home, the house looked the same. The sun was slanting through the blinds in the kitchen, casting those same long shadows across the tile floor. The coffee pot was still half full. A pair of sandals had been left by the back door. There was a grocery bag on the counter with fruit I hadn't bought. Everything was in place, untouched, unbothered. And yet the entire place felt different, like someone had rearranged the furniture while keeping everything where it was. I didn't take off my boots. I walked straight through the kitchen, past the hallway photos, into the garage, and sat down on the wooden step by the water heater. That step had been there for years. I had built it myself, back when my knees still bent easily, and I thought wood could hold together anything. I sat with my elbows on my knees, staring at the concrete floor, like it was some kind of map. The silence didn't press against me. It accepted me. It wrapped around me like old clothing, familiar, worn thin in places. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I didn't think of calling anyone. I just sat. That's what old men do when things shift. We don't explode. We compress. We let the world pour its weight on top of us like wet cement, and we wait. I had nothing to say, no one to say it to. Words would have cracked under the pressure of what I had seen. So I swallowed them whole. Sandra came home later that evening. I heard her key in the door, her footsteps in the hallway. She put her purse down on the same hook she always used. She didn't call out for me. She didn't ask where I'd been. That was the new routine. Silence had become our default setting. She moved through the kitchen, opened the fridge, closed it again. I listened to her pour a glass of something. Water, maybe. Wine. I didn't get up to check. I didn't want to know. I stayed in the garage long enough for my legs to stiffen. When I finally stood, the ache in my joints reminded me of every project, every ladder climbed, every roof patched in the August heat. I walked back into the house with the slow gait of a man carrying something invisible and heavy. I didn't look at her as I passed. She didn't look at me. Two ghosts sharing a hallway, brushing past each other without sound. That night, I lay in bed with my eyes open. The ceiling fan clicked with a rhythm I couldn't turn off. I stared at the tiny crack in the plaster above my side of the bed, the one I had been meaning to fix for months, maybe years. I thought about the click of the wine glasses, the casual brush of fingers, the way her body leaned toward him without hesitation. I thought about the softness in her smile that I hadn't seen in my direction since before the kids moved out. And I thought about how none of that surprised me as much as it should have. There's a moment when realization settles so deep into your bones that it stops feeling like shock and starts feeling like something older, like knowledge that was always there but never spoken aloud. I had known, maybe not in facts, but in shape, in absence, in the way she no longer asked where I was going, or what I thought of the news, or whether I liked the meatloaf, in the way her voice lowered when the phone rang, in the way she smiled at her reflection more often than at me. I began to move differently after that night. I didn't stomp through the house like I used to. I walked softly, with intention, careful not to disturb what had already begun to rot. I made my breakfast before dawn, washed the pan, wiped the counters. I didn't leave crumbs. I didn't leave noise. I became a presence without weight, a man whose shadow knew better than to stretch into the wrong room. I stopped watching TV in the living room. I brought the old radio from the garage into the den and played the weather reports and talk shows I used to enjoy. Low volume, just enough to feel like the house had a pulse. I sat with my notebook and wrote down measurements for things I no longer planned to build. It wasn't about the future. It was about memory, about proving I still had the lines in my head. I avoided the kitchen when she was in it. I avoided the back porch if her phone was glowing in her hand. I became a master of schedules, when to disappear, when to reappear, when to make just enough sound to remind her I existed, and not a decibel more. I had turned into a shape that fit around her life without interrupting it. My truck became my shelter. I'd sit inside it with the window down, watching the mailbox, watching the streetlights come on. Sometimes I drove to nowhere. Sometimes I parked by the lake and stared at the water until the sky changed. I liked the way the air smelled out there, like earth, like something that hadn't been touched by lies. I found my old photo albums in the attic one morning, covered in dust, the pages curled, the corners yellowing. I flipped through them alone in the garage. Our wedding day, the kids at Christmas, Sandra holding Emily as a baby. My face looked different in those photos. Not just younger, fuller, certain. I stared at the pictures longer than I meant to. I didn't cry. I closed the book slowly, like something sacred. I no longer expected conversations. I stopped offering commentary. When Sandra asked about the mail, I handed it to her wordlessly. When she mentioned needing more paper towels, I made a note in my head and bought them without being asked. I didn't need thanks. I just needed to do things that made me feel human. I began writing lists, not of chores or groceries, but memories, good ones. The time we camped near the Smoky Mountains and it rained all night. The time Emily lost her tooth in a hotel room in Florida and we used a paper towel to wrap it. The day I fixed the floorboard in the guest room and Sandra brought me lemonade without saying a word. I wrote these things down because I didn't trust memory to keep them upright. One afternoon, I saw her car keys on the table. I stared at them for a full minute. My fingers twitched, but I didn't touch them. I turned and walked out of the house and raked leaves instead. That was who I had become. A man who held everything in, who said nothing, who moved through the world like wind over stone, shaping it silently, slowly, and without applause. I wasn't angry. I wasn't broken. I was just quiet. And sometimes, quiet is louder than anything else. There was a time when the scent of coffee in the morning was the anchor of my day. It started before the sun, back when my hands still worked without pain, and my thoughts hadn't yet fractured into doubt. The gurgle of the old drip machine, the soft clink of the spoon in the mug, the way the aroma would fill the hallway like a quiet reassurance that the world was still turning, that used to mean something. Now even the coffee felt hollow. The pot still brewed. Sandra still made it. The same beans, the same routine. But somewhere in the process, the soul of it had gone missing. The scent no longer warmed the walls. It no longer pulled me out of bed with any anticipation. It was just noise now, mechanical, perfunctory, a ghost of itself, like everything else in the house. I used to wake early. I still did. But now I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to summon the will to move. The light crept through the blinds the same way it always had, thin and gray, but I felt no urgency to follow it. Mornings became a negotiation between my body and my reason. Eventually I would sit up, swing my legs over the side of the bed, and take those same 6 steps to the hallway, like a man walking into a room that no longer wanted him. Sandra would already be in the kitchen, her back turned, her robe tied tightly, the belt hanging loose down the side of her leg. She didn't hum anymore. She used to. Old jazz tunes, sometimes hymns. But now the kitchen was quiet, except for the whir of the machine and the occasional clatter of a cup on the counter. I stood there many mornings, just outside the doorway, watching her in silence before turning toward the garage instead. I kept a mug in the garage now, a chipped one, from a hardware store convention back in the 80s. I poured from the pot when she wasn't looking, filled it halfway, drank it out by the water heater. It tasted the same, burnt, bitter. But it was the ritual that mattered more than the flavor. Except the ritual had lost its meaning, too. One morning, I opened the cupboard where we kept the sugar and saw a new container, something imported, organic, the kind of thing Sandra used to laugh at. She didn't tell me she switched. I stood there holding the glass jar in my hand for a while, staring at the label, feeling like I had stumbled into a stranger's pantry. I put it back without using any. I started noticing other changes, small things. The soap by the sink had a different scent. The hand towels were replaced with ones I didn't recognize. The magnets on the fridge were rearranged. The calendar no longer had handwritten notes. Instead, reminders lived in her phone, silent, glowing, private. I watched these details pile up like dust in corners no one bothered to sweep. She came and went with an ease that left no trace, her shoes by the door, her purse on the hook. But her presence had become intermittent, like a breeze you weren't sure you felt. I asked less and less, not because I didn't want to know, but because the answers had stopped being offered. And when silence becomes the answer, questions lose their shape. I tried to stay busy. I fixed a loose handle on the hallway door, repainted the edge of the porch steps where the wood had grayed, cleaned the gutters without being asked. These were the things that once earned me smiles, nods, touches on the arm. Now they earned nothing. I didn't mind the lack of gratitude. I minded the absence of acknowledgement. I was no longer building something with her. I was maintaining the bones of something already dead. I found myself in the attic more often, not for any particular reason, just to sit. There was a folding chair up there, next to an old trunk filled with baby clothes and high school yearbooks. I'd open the trunk sometimes and sift through the layers. A onesie with a yellow stain, a tassel from a graduation cap, a Valentine's Day card that had my name in her handwriting, once loopy and playful. I held on to those artifacts longer than I should have. They felt heavier than they were. One afternoon, I stood in the living room and looked around as if seeing the house for the first time. The walls, once painted by our own hands, had been redone in a colder shade. The photographs on the mantel were mostly of the kids, the grandkids, her garden. I wasn't in many of them. The ones that did include me were older, framed in wood that had started to warp. I listened for sounds, footsteps, conversation, laughter, but heard nothing. The television wasn't on. The phone wasn't ringing. The house had settled into a stillness that felt permanent. It didn't grieve. It didn't breathe. It just existed, like a stage after the actors had left. I cooked dinner for myself most nights. Simple things: eggs, toast, canned soup. She ate at different times, in different rooms, sometimes not at all. She said she wasn't hungry, or she had plans. I never asked what they were. I just nodded and cleared my plate. One night I caught sight of my reflection in the window. I was standing at the sink, washing a fork. My face looked tired, but not from age. It was the kind of tired that comes from holding everything in, from knowing too much and saying nothing, from being replaced without ever being told. I dried the fork and placed it in the drawer. I stood there for a long time, staring into the empty sink. The faucet had a slow drip I hadn't bothered to fix. The house no longer smelled like coffee. It smelled like air and paint and resignation, like something carefully preserved, not lived in, like a home that had outgrown the people who built it. I stood there until the light changed, until the windows darkened, and the room blurred around me. Then I turned off the light, walked down the hallway, and disappeared into the quiet. It started with the rain, a soft, insistent patter that worked its way into the walls, the gutters, the spaces between thoughts. I had always liked the sound of rain on the roof, especially on Sundays, when the house felt slow and grounded. That morning, I sat in the armchair by the hallway, listening to it tap against the windows, watching the way it gathered and ran down the glass in tiny rivers. I hadn't planned to open the hallway closet. It was one of those corners of the house we rarely visited anymore. The place where old blankets lived, where holiday decorations were stuffed into plastic bins, where photographs used to be. But the rain made everything feel like a memory, and I suppose I needed to touch something real. The door creaked open like it hadn't been moved in months. A smell of dust and linen rose up, faint, but familiar. I reached in and pulled out one of the larger storage boxes from the bottom shelf. My hands moved slowly, careful not to disturb whatever fragile truth lived inside. I placed the box on the floor, knelt beside it, and opened the lid. Inside were scarves, gloves, and folded tablecloths, seasonal things, carefully stacked, untouched for years. I moved them aside gently, expecting to see the old envelopes we had kept, fat with prints from disposable cameras, black and white ones from our early years, school portraits of the children with awkward smiles and stiff collars. But they weren't there. I searched deeper, moving through layers of unused winter wear and a broken string of Christmas lights. Still nothing. No photo albums, no picture frames, no stray snapshots clipped together with a paperclip the way Sandra used to do. It was as if they had been removed entirely, erased like chalk from a slate. I checked the shelf above, then the one below. Empty bins, a box labeled "Donate" in her handwriting, but no photographs. I sat back and stared at the open closet. For a moment I wondered if I had imagined their existence. Maybe I had moved them years ago and forgotten. But I hadn't. I remembered exactly how they had been stacked, the way the cardboard edges had frayed, how the album covers peeled at the corners from too much handling. They had lived here. This closet had held our life. And now it didn't. I stood up, my knees popping with effort, and pulled down the other boxes, one by one. Gardening supplies, spare curtains, even a roll of unused wallpaper from a project we never finished. But not a single photograph, not a single image of the life we had built, the children we had raised, the moments we once thought were worth keeping. I checked the cabinet in the hallway, the drawers in the guest room, even the garage shelves where I stored old tools. Nothing. The albums were gone, not lost, not misplaced, removed, deliberately, silently. Back in the living room, I sat on the edge of the couch and stared at the mantel. The framed pictures there told a newer story. Sandra with the grandchildren at the beach, Emily and Jason at their anniversary dinner, the dog we never adopted but somehow ended up in our home. My presence was minimal. A single photo from 20 years ago, tucked into the corner, partially obscured by a ceramic vase. I felt like a guest in my own life's gallery. That night, I lay awake thinking about the weight of absence. Not just the missing objects, but the decision behind their removal. Someone had opened those albums, flipped through the pages, and decided they no longer belonged. Someone had deemed those moments unworthy of space. I tried to recall specific images. The one of Sandra in the garden, sun hat too big for her face. The boys building a snowman that collapsed before we could photograph it. The vacation to Colorado, where I wore a ridiculous parka and pretended I wasn't freezing. I could still see them in my mind, but memory isn't the same as proof, and the older I got, the more I craved proof. Over the next few days, I began to search in quiet, unspoken ways. I checked the attic twice, looked through the cabinets beneath the bathroom sink, even though I knew how absurd that was. I opened the drawers in her craft room and rifled gently through them, careful not to leave a trace. I found greeting cards, receipts, half-used journals, but not the photos. I never asked her about them, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I understood the silence it would bring. Some things, once questioned, collapse under their own truth. I wasn't ready to hear her say, "I put them away," or worse, "I didn't think you'd notice." I preferred the emptiness. At least it didn't speak. Instead, I began to sketch. On the back of scrap paper, in the margins of old notebooks, I drew outlines of what I remembered. Not full portraits, just moments. The curve of a cheek, the slant of a smile, the way a hand rested on a shoulder. I wasn't an artist, but it wasn't about accuracy. It was about reclaiming space. I taped some of them inside the closet where the albums used to be. A quiet rebellion, a silent monument. Sandra never noticed, or if she did, she never said. One morning, I found a new photo on the fridge. Jason and Sandra, smiling by a lake, arms around each other, matching jackets. The image was recent. I hadn't been told about the trip. I stood there a long time, the milk in my hand, growing warm. Then I placed it back in the fridge, walked to the garage, and opened the box where I kept my sketches. I added one more. It wasn't of her. It wasn't of the children. It was of the hallway closet. Closed, locked, empty. And in that drawing, I gave it a new name. I wrote it in pencil, small, just below the frame. Here once lived a man. It was a Tuesday when I opened the drawer. The rain had returned after a long dry spell, and the sound of it against the windows made the house feel even more hollow than usual. I had been sitting in the den, staring at a crossword I couldn't finish, when the memory of those papers surfaced like a bubble rising from still water. I stood up, walked into the bedroom, and opened the old cedar dresser that had once held my undershirts and spare belts. The bottom drawer, stiff from disuse, creaked when I pulled it open. They were still there. A folder, thick and faded at the edges, filled with documents I had kept for decades. Not for any sentimental reason, but because I understood the value of what people signed when they thought they still needed you. Wills, deeds, insurance forms, tax records, the original mortgage, everything with my name on it, everything with my signature. Paper doesn't age the way people do. It yellows, It curls, but it doesn't forget. I laid the folder out on the bed, its weight surprising even me. I hadn't looked at these papers in years. There had been no need. We had shared everything, or so I thought. But now, surrounded by silence and secrets, I wanted to know what was still mine. I wanted to hold something that hadn't been quietly taken or erased. The first document I pulled out was the deed to the house. My name was listed first, hers second. I ran my finger over the ink like it was braille, as if touch might confirm what sight already knew. I remembered the day we signed it. Sandra had been excited, her voice full of plans for a garden, a porch swing, a place to grow old. I had nodded, smiling, already thinking about the pipes and the wiring. We had come to the same dream from different doors. I kept going. Next was the life insurance policy, drawn up back when the kids were still in school. I had increased the payout after my first heart scare. Sandra had insisted we didn't need to, but I did it anyway. The beneficiaries were listed in my handwriting. Her name first, then the kids. I had updated it once after Emily's wedding, just to make sure everything was even. I wondered now if fairness had ever really mattered. I found the retirement account paperwork, the original setup from my union days. The contact information was outdated, the logo of the institution no longer in use, but the numbers still meant something. I had worked hard for that. Weekends, holidays, double shifts in the heat of Georgia summers. It was all here in black and white, proof of labor, of time traded for security. I hadn't looked at the balance in a long time. I wasn't sure I wanted to. Buried deeper were letters, old ones. From the bank, the insurance company, the contractor's office where I used to consult after retiring. Most of them were reminders, statements, updates. But one envelope was different, thicker, sealed. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was mine. I had written it years ago, one of those just-in-case letters, meant to be read if something ever happened to me unexpectedly. A quiet attempt to leave things in order, to offer words I might never have the chance to say. I hadn't thought about it in a long time. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I pulled out the final sheet in the stack. A power of attorney form, blank, never filled out. I had printed it once, thinking we might need it when Sandra's mother fell ill, but we never did. It sat there as a silent question. Who would I trust if I couldn't speak? Who would speak for me? I folded everything back neatly, except the deed. I held on to that one. I took it with me to the kitchen table and sat under the dim overhead light, reading it again and again. My name. Her name. Our address. But names on paper don't mean loyalty. They don't mean presence. They don't mean love. They just mean ownership. That night, after Sandra had gone to bed, I sat with the deed in my lap and thought about what it really meant. Not in a legal sense, but in a human one. This house, this space, had been built with intention, with sweat and planning, with hands that now trembled when holding a fork. I had chosen the hardwood floors, nailed the trim myself, patched the drywall after the roof leak. I had painted the front door 3 times because she kept changing her mind about the color. This was my home, even if I was no longer welcome in the parts of it that mattered. Even if the smell of her perfume in the hallway now made my stomach tighten instead of my chest warm. Even if my photograph had disappeared from the hallway wall. The papers told me I still existed, that I hadn't imagined the life I'd spent decades building. They reminded me that I had held something, that I had mattered, not just as a presence, but as a foundation. I put the folder back in the drawer, carefully, like returning something sacred to an altar. But the deed, I kept that out. I slid it into a new envelope and placed it in the filing cabinet in the garage. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere she wouldn't think to look. The next morning, I made coffee the way I used to. 2 scoops, extra strong. The smell still didn't linger the way it once had, but I drank it anyway. I sat at the table, the house creaking softly in the early light, and waited for her footsteps. When she passed behind me, she didn't notice the missing drawer in the bedroom. She didn't notice the slight change in the cabinet's arrangement. She didn't notice me at all. But the papers were with me now, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had something she couldn't touch, something solid, something real. It wasn't revenge. It was reminder that I was still here, on paper, and in truth. I wrote the letter on a Thursday afternoon. It was one of those dry, brittle days when the sun hung high but gave off no warmth. The air felt heavy without being hot, and the shadows from the trees outside fell sharp against the fence like something drawn in ink. I had just come in from sweeping the front porch, though no one asked me to. I didn't do things because I was asked anymore. I did them because they were the last bits of order I could still control. I sat down at the small desk in the back room, the one that had become mine by default after the kids left, and Sandra turned the office into her sewing space. The desk was old. Oak, I think. It had a scratch across the top from when our son once dragged a pair of scissors across it in a fit of boredom. I had kept the scratch, never sanded it out. It felt honest. I pulled out a piece of plain white paper from the drawer. Not a card, not something fancy. Just a sheet, clean, untouched, waiting. I found a pen, the same one I used to use to sign contractor forms and tax returns. It didn't feel like a special occasion, but I treated it like one anyway. I wasn't sure who I was writing to at first. Not to Sandra, not to the children, not even to Jason or the people who had slowly carved me out of my own life. I realized, somewhere between the first and second sentence, that I was writing to myself. The letter began simply, the way you'd speak to someone you hadn't seen in years, but still recognized in a crowd. "Henry," I wrote, "this is what you've become." And then the words came, slow at first, uneven, like trying to remember the lyrics to an old song, but they picked up pace as my hand warmed to the rhythm, and soon I was pouring it out. The weight, the confusion, the loneliness that had been tightening in my chest for months. I wrote about the silence, about how a house can be full of movement but empty of life. I described how she moved through rooms like I wasn't there, how even her footsteps seemed quieter when they passed me. I detailed the small ways a man can vanish without anyone noticing, how a photo disappears from the shelf, how a favorite coffee mug ends up in a donation box, how your opinion stops being sought and eventually stops being offered. I wrote about the closet where the photos had been, about how the absence of something can feel louder than its presence. I described how I had found the papers in the drawer, how my name still sat there in ink, firm and unshaken, while my actual self had become a shadow. I didn't censor my thoughts. I didn't try to be poetic. I wrote plainly, the way a carpenter might measure a wall, line by line, no room for embellishment. I wrote about the pain of being looked through, the pain of being remembered only when something broke or needed paying for. I admitted that I no longer recognized my own marriage, that the woman I had once built a life with now felt like someone else's guest. I confessed the things I'd been too proud to say aloud, that I was angry, that I was afraid, that I was tired, not just in body, but in spirit, that I had sat in my truck on more than one occasion, gripping the wheel until my knuckles went white, unsure of whether to drive away or drive straight through the fog of everything that had been taken from me. I told myself that I had done my best, that I had worked hard, that I had provided, protected, endured. I reminded myself that I had built homes with my hands, raised children with my heart, and stayed when it would have been easier to go. I wrote that staying wasn't weakness. It was proof of who I was. Toward the end of the letter, I let my words soften. I wrote to the version of me that still existed somewhere under the silence. The one that remembered the way Sandra's hand used to rest on my arm in the grocery store. The one that used to sing along to the radio in the truck on long drives. the one that built a swing set in the backyard on his only weekend off because his daughter wanted to fly. I reminded him that he was still here, and I reminded him that leaving didn't always mean packing a bag or slamming a door. Sometimes leaving meant pulling back from where you weren't wanted. Sometimes it meant deciding, quietly and without drama, that you wouldn't be erased any further. I signed the letter with my full name, Henry Thomas Miller. Then I folded it once, clean and sharp. I didn't place it in an envelope. I didn't hide it in a drawer. I laid it flat beneath the toolbox in the garage, where I knew it wouldn't be found accidentally. It wasn't meant to be read by anyone else. Not now. Maybe not ever. I returned to the kitchen and made a sandwich. The act felt absurdly ordinary after what I had just written. I sat at the table, chewing slowly, watching the dust float in the beam of light coming through the window. Nothing had changed. And yet something had. The letter hadn't solved anything. It hadn't fixed the silence. But it had pulled something out of me, something I hadn't been able to name. I felt lighter, not happier, just less full of the unspoken. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought of the letter. I pictured it sitting in the garage beneath the old red box that held my screwdrivers. A small testament, a declaration that I had seen what was happening and that I hadn't gone quietly, not completely. It was a letter I never sent, but it was the first thing I had said in a long, long time. It happened early in the morning, just after the fog had lifted and the sun had started to dry the dew on the lawn. I was sitting in my truck, watching the street from a distance, the way I used to watch a job site before the crew arrived. It was quiet, just the hum of insects and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. A slow hour, the kind most people waste without knowing it. But I felt every second of it, each one ticking in my chest like the beat of something winding down. I had left the house the night before without a sound. I packed light, one duffel bag, my wallet, a folder with the papers, and the letter I never sent. I didn't leave a note. I didn't slam any doors. I just walked out, not in anger, but in completion, like turning off the last light before locking up an old building. I stayed with a friend from the union that night, someone who owed me nothing but gave me a spare room without questions. He was the kind of man who understood what silence meant between men our age. We didn't talk much. I slept in a bed that wasn't mine, but it held me better than the one I'd left. The next morning I drove back, not to return, just to watch. I had put the plan in place weeks ago, slowly, carefully, nothing loud, nothing that would alert anyone. I'd gone to the county office. I'd spoken to a lawyer I trusted. I'd signed forms with a clear hand and a clear heart. Ownership had changed, accounts had shifted, and the locks, those had been changed too. I sat in the truck, watching the driveway. The house looked the same. That's the strange thing about endings. They don't announce themselves. They just settle in, quiet and cold. The porch still had the hanging fern she watered every Thursday. The mailbox still leaned slightly to the left from when the snowplow clipped it last winter. Everything familiar, everything meaningless now. And then I saw her car turn onto the street. Sandra was driving, Jason in the passenger seat. They were talking, laughing about something. He had a coffee in one hand. She was gesturing with her free hand, animated in a way I hadn't seen in years. I didn't move. I just watched. They pulled into the driveway. She stepped out first, swinging her purse over her shoulder. Jason followed, grabbing something from the back seat. A box. I couldn't see what was inside. They walked to the front door together. I watched her reach into her purse. She pulled out the key, and I waited. She slid it into the lock, and I waited. Then it happened. The key didn't turn. She tried again. Slower, more deliberate. It still didn't turn. Jason stepped closer. He took the key from her and tried it himself. He jiggled it, leaned into the door, pushed while twisting. Nothing. The deadbolt held. The door didn't budge. I watched from behind tinted glass, heart steady, breath even. She looked confused at first, then annoyed. She checked the number above the door as if somehow it might have changed. Jason knocked once, then looked through the sidelight window. He tried the handle again. Nothing. Then she reached for her phone. I knew she would. She tried calling. I didn't answer. She left a message. I didn't listen to it. They stood there for a while, shifting their weight, growing more frustrated with each passing minute. I could almost feel it through the windshield. Not panic, just a slow, dawning awareness that something had shifted beyond their control. Jason walked around the side of the house, probably to try the back door. I had changed that lock too. I had changed all of them. When he returned, his expression was different, less confident, more confused. She sat down on the porch step, her purse still in her lap. I could see her breathing, deep and sharp, like someone trying to make sense of a fire that left no smoke. Jason stood above her, phone in hand, pacing. Eventually, they both sat, waiting. But I never came. After an hour, they drove away. I stayed in the truck long after they were gone. I stared at the house, the place I had built, repaired, repainted, forgiven. I thought about all the things that had happened behind those walls. The holidays, the arguments, the quiet mornings, the nights when the silence was louder than any fight. And I thought about the key, that small piece of metal, once a symbol of trust, now just an artifact of a past they no longer had access to. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just felt still. That door hadn't been mine for a long time. Not really. But now, finally, it wasn't theirs either. Not because I took it from them, but because they gave it away a long time ago, piece by piece. In all the small ways people discard what they no longer value. The key not turning was only the final confirmation. They would call. They would ask. They would demand. But I wouldn't answer, because some doors are meant to stay closed, and some men, even old ones, know when it's time to walk away from the house they once built and lock it behind them for good. I didn't look back after I turned onto the road that led away from that house. There was nothing there I needed anymore. Not a photograph, not a coat, not an apology. What I had left behind could stay behind, and what I took with me was mine, because I had chosen it. That was the difference now. Everything I did came from choice, not habit. There's a quiet power in that, especially when you've spent years being moved like furniture rather than standing like a man. I drove for hours, not toward anything in particular, but away from everything familiar. Roads stretched out ahead of me like questions I didn't have to answer. The lines on the pavement didn't judge me. The engine didn't ask for explanations. I had food in the cooler, cash in my wallet, and the deed locked in a fireproof envelope under the seat. I didn't need more. I had arranged for the trailer ahead of time. A small place by the lake in a quiet corner of Georgia, not far from where I had grown up. A friend of a friend owned the property. It wasn't much, just an old mobile home with a porch held together by faith and rust. But it sat under trees that moved with the wind, and the water lapped gently against the rocks in a way that made it easier to think. The first night I slept there, the silence was different. Not hollow, not cold, just mine. I woke with the sun and opened every window. The air came in damp and clean. I made coffee on a portable stove and drank it slowly, letting the heat warm my chest. It still didn't smell the way it used to, but it no longer mattered. It wasn't about the coffee. It was about waking up without pretending, about putting my feet on a floor that hadn't been pulled from under me. I spent my days fixing what needed fixing. The porch had a slant, so I braced it. The screen door sagged, so I replaced the hinges. There was no rush, no one waiting for it to be done. I worked with my hands the way I always had, but now the only voice I had to answer to was the one in my own chest, and it had grown quiet, steady, like it trusted me again. I met people slowly. An older man named Roy who fished near the dock. A widow who ran the tiny grocery store on the edge of town. They didn't ask about my past, and I didn't offer. I wasn't hiding. I was simply starting again, brick by quiet brick. No announcements, no declarations, just days, lived, not endured. I started reading again. Old books I found in a bin at the thrift store. Westerns, war memoirs, a few battered paperbacks with pages soft from years of turning. I sat in a chair by the window and read until the light faded. Sometimes I underlined sentences that felt true. Sometimes I just traced the words with my finger, grateful for language that understood solitude. At night, I wrote lists, not of things to do, but of things I remembered. My daughter's laugh when she was 6, the way the dog used to curl around my feet when I read the paper, the smell of rain on new wood. I didn't write them to keep the past alive. I wrote them to remind myself that I had lived well once, that I had known love, even if it hadn't lasted, that my story wasn't just about what was taken, but what had been real. I walked every morning, around the lake, through the trees, along the gravel road that cut through the pines. The rhythm of my steps became a kind of prayer, each footfall saying, I am here, I am here, I am still here. No one called, not the children, not Sandra, not Jason. I knew they wouldn't, or maybe they did, and I just never picked up. I'd left the phone in the drawer. The voicemail filled up in a week. I deleted it without listening. Whatever they had to say, it came too late. I didn't need their anger or their confusion. I didn't need their attempts at understanding, because they never had, and I had stopped hoping they would. I paid my bills in cash. I repaired the dock when it split in the middle. I fixed a neighbor's shed after a storm. People started leaving little gifts, jars of jam, a pie, a paperback. I accepted them without fuss, not because I needed them, but because I understood the language of quiet gratitude. It said more than any apology ever had. I kept a fire going some nights, just small, just enough to smell the smoke and remember that warmth could still be made with your own hands. I sat in front of it and watched the embers rise like tiny lanterns into the dark. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to be good, trying to be useful, trying to be wanted, and I realized I had always been enough. They had simply stopped seeing it. That thought didn't hurt anymore. It clarified. One afternoon, I sat on the porch, polishing an old chisel I found in a box of tools I had nearly thrown away. The sun was going down. The lake had turned a kind of silver I'd never seen before. In that moment, I felt a peace I didn't think I would ever feel again, not because I had forgiven everything, but because I had remembered who I was. I was the man who built things with care, the man who stayed quiet when others shouted, the man who saw through walls and silence alike, the man who, when it came time, knew exactly what he was doing, and did it. It was a Monday, a quiet, flat sort of Monday, the kind that begins without ceremony and passes without noise. I had woken up before sunrise, not from restlessness, but from habit. My eyes opened to the faint blue of morning, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the weight pressing down on my chest before I even swung my legs out of bed. The room was cool, the air still, and my breath came easy. I sat up slowly and realized I wasn't carrying the usual heaviness, not in my back, not in my thoughts, not behind my eyes. It had been months since I'd left, though I had stopped counting the days. Time had blurred in the best way, no longer measured by routines I hadn't chosen or silence I didn't understand. Here, in this small borrowed corner of the world, days didn't arrive with expectation. They just showed up, and I let them. That morning, I walked to the lake barefoot. The grass was wet with dew, but I didn't mind. I let my toes sink into the soft ground, steadying myself like a man who still believed in the weight of his own presence. The surface of the water was perfectly still. I watched it for a while, until the wind picked up just enough to ripple it. No violence, just movement. It reminded me of a line I had read once, something about how peace wasn't the absence of storms, but the presence of clarity. I never fully understood it until that moment. There had been pain, so much of it, layered like sediment in a riverbed. Disappointment, betrayal, confusion, grief. All of it had settled inside me for years, hardening in quiet ways. But that morning, it felt like something had shifted, not erased, just softened, like scar tissue instead of a wound. I made breakfast slowly. Eggs, toast, coffee brewed over a small gas flame. The smell filled the trailer, and for once it didn't remind me of anything. It just was. The toast crackled when I bit into it. The eggs tasted like they were supposed to, and the coffee, still bitter and dark, sat warm in my palms. I didn't miss anything. I didn't look for echoes. I just sat and ate. I had learned to live without noise, without constant explanations, without the weight of waiting for someone else to speak first. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was generous. It gave me back things I had forgotten I needed: my breath, my balance, my ability to move through the day without clenching my jaw. Later, I pulled out a box I hadn't touched in weeks. Inside were the sketches I had done when I first arrived, fragments of memory drawn in pencil and hesitation. I laid them out on the table and studied each one. The lines were rough, uneven in places, but I could see the truth in them. Not just what I remembered, but how I had felt. I had drawn a house without windows, a man sitting in a room with no door, a closet full of light with no one inside. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the sting I used to when I looked at them. Instead, I smiled, not because they were beautiful, but because they were honest. I gathered them carefully and placed them back in the box, this time with intention. I didn't need to look at them again, but I also didn't need to burn them. They were part of the trail that led me here. I honored them by keeping them, not by clinging to them. That afternoon, I walked to the old dock. The boards were uneven, and the nails had started to rust, but it held my weight. I sat at the edge and let my feet dangle just above the water. A breeze came in from the west, lifting the leaves, brushing against my face like an old friend. I closed my eyes and listened, not for footsteps, not for voices, but for the sound of nothing. And that nothing was full. For a long time, I believed healing would come like thunder, like a declaration. I thought it would be a moment of clarity or confrontation, but it came instead, like a still day in late spring. No fanfare, no applause, just a subtle, unmistakable absence of pain, a quiet reclaiming of breath. As the sun moved overhead, I thought about the years I had given to people who no longer thought about me, and I felt no bitterness. They had taken what they needed, and I had let them. But I had taken something back, something quiet, something mine. They didn't know it. They didn't have to. I stood and stretched, letting my spine pop, letting my arms fall loosely at my sides. I walked back slowly, savoring the sound of gravel underfoot. I passed the mailbox and noticed a letter had been slipped inside. No name, no return address, just a small white envelope. I didn't open it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because whatever it said, it couldn't change the fact that I had already found what I needed. I had found the day when it didn't hurt. And I had lived it. Not for anyone else. Just for me. It was a Thursday when the letter finally arrived. Not a letter, really. Just a formal notice. The kind printed on stiff paper and folded with mechanical precision. It had my name on it, but the words inside weren't for me. They were written in the language of confusion, bureaucracy, and desperation. It was from a lawyer I didn't know, hired by people who used to know me. The tone was urgent, the questions sharp. Why had the locks been changed? Who owned the house now? What had happened to the accounts, the paperwork, the rights they assumed were theirs? I read it once, slowly, then set it down on the counter beside my coffee mug. The mug was chipped on the rim. I liked it that way. It reminded me that useful things don't have to be perfect, and that time leaves marks on everything worth keeping. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. They already knew the answer. Sandra had likely been the first to notice. She would have walked to the drawer where the tax documents were kept and found it empty. Then the bank statements. Then the insurance forms. All gone. Not stolen. Not misplaced. Relocated. Removed by the same steady hands that once repaired their broken chairs and cleaned the gutters they forgot about. I hadn't left a mess. Just a silence too precise to be accidental. Jason, I imagined, would have paced through the house, phone in hand, disbelief turning into anger. He would have called someone, anyone with authority, assuming the world would bend to his voice. And when it didn't, when the facts began to align into a shape he couldn't control, he would have sat down and realized that power is only real when someone allows it to be. Emily might have cried. Or maybe not. Maybe she would have shrugged and said I had finally lost it, that I had gone off the deep end, that it was just age, or resentment, or some pathetic cry for attention. But I knew what she'd feel when she passed my old bedroom, when she saw the empty walls and the cleaned-out closet. That ache behind the ribs when someone has left without saying goodbye. That's what I had done. Left, without a word. Not in protest, not in rage, just in silence. But it was the kind of silence they would not forget. It filled the house louder than a voice ever could. In every drawer they opened, in every call that went unanswered, in every memory they tried to rewrite, they would hear it. The absence of me, the absence of the man they had turned into background noise, the one who had quietly disappeared while they were busy talking over him. I took walks each evening now, long ones, past fields lined with wildflowers, past porches where other old men sat with dogs at their feet. No one asked me where I came from. No one asked why I was alone. They just nodded. That was enough. A nod is worth more than 1,000 hollow words when it comes from someone who knows the weight of stillness. At the local library, I started reading about trees, not just the names, but their habits, the way roots reach even in rock, the way some trees bleed when cut, the way others grow rings so tightly they can outlast storms. I liked that. I like the idea of something strong and patient. I like the idea that growth could be quiet and still matter. I passed the post office one morning and saw Jason's name on a forwarded envelope, scrawled in that impatient handwriting of his. I watched the clerk sort it like any other piece of mail. That's all we are to some people. Names in boxes, addresses to be updated or crossed out. I walked out without speaking. There were days when I thought of Sandra, not with longing, but with clarity. I remembered the way she once laughed in the kitchen while icing a birthday cake, the way her hand rested lightly on my shoulder when she wanted me to stop talking and listen. I remembered her as she had been before silence settled between us like a cold sheet. Those memories no longer hurt. They were just pages in a book I no longer needed to reopen. I never blocked their numbers. I never changed my name. I didn't have to. My absence was louder than their pursuit. They had my number. They had my name. They had every chance to see me before I was gone. They simply chose not to look until it was too late. They hadn't understood that silence was a language, that it wasn't emptiness. It was deliberate, considered, weighted. It was the answer to all the things they thought would go unchallenged. It was the boundary I never spoke aloud, and now it lived between us like a wall they couldn't tear down. Sometimes I imagined them gathering in the house, my old house, trying to piece together what had happened, wondering how they missed it, wondering how I could have slipped through the cracks of their attention without a trace. But I hadn't slipped. I had walked. I had chosen the quiet. And they, in their noise, had never heard me leave. One evening, I sat on my small porch, a cup of tea in hand, watching the sun fold itself behind the hills. The light stretched long and low, golden and kind. I listened to the wind move through the trees. I listened to the creak of the wood beneath my chair. And I felt peace, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that demands recognition, but the kind that settles in your chest like breath after a long run. That silence. It was mine. And they would remember it. Every birthday they forgot I attended. Every chair they filled without asking if I'd be joining. Every whisper they thought I hadn't heard. They would remember the man who said nothing. The man who stayed calm. The man who knew what mattered and who chose to disappear without permission. Because silence, when it's earned, is unforgettable. And I had earned mine.